I think a favourite thing about being an MP is it's the constituency work, and the fact that so many people can just walk in off the street and you just don't know what it's going to be and who they're going to be and what they want to talk about. I think it's an amazing thing, because there's no other job because it's a vehicle, being an MP. You sort of inherit that vehicle from someone else and you'll hand it on to someone else. But it means that I can go into any community, any neighbourhood, and I can knock on any door and I can talk about any subject. So I can knock on a door this weekend and I can say, there's a lot of issues with our local health service or the train service. Can I please get your experiences, hear your views on it, please? Or I can go to a neighbourhood and say, next weekend we're going to all come together and we're going to talk about the local park or a big issue, global warming or Brexit, and we can all just take over a space. And we do this very often down in Hove, and we talk about these things. There's no other job in the world that enables you to go into a community and then bring the community together and talk about any issue and try and lead and sometimes follow a community through those sorts of changes. And I think that is just the most extraordinary privilege that anyone can have.
If the Treasury miraculously found £1 billion spare and it was up to you how to spend it, but you could only spend it on one thing, what would you choose and why?
I don't think this is a fantasy question, because the Treasury did find £1 billion and it gave it to the DUP. So we know that this is actually, quite a serious question. So when the government offered me £1 billion, I know exactly what I'd spend it on. I would give it to balance out the money that is spent on young people. We give a very disproportionate amount of funding to young people in their pathways into the labour market and through childhood and young adulthood. So, for example, the money usually follows the institution, doesn't follow the young person. So if you're a young person that's lucky enough to go to university, particularly a prestige university, the government is going to fund that place even above tuition fees to the tune of £6,000 to £8,000. If you go to FE college, it's about half that. If you get an apprenticeship, it's about £1,200. If I had the ability to spend £1 billion, I would level out that funding so that every young person gets the same amount of investment in them, whatever the pathway they take.
Given the rapid evolution of technology, it's possible that at some stage in the future, the electorate might be able to vote directly for bills passing through the Houses of Parliament. Would you see that as a good or a bad thing, and what would you see as the role of an MP in such a scenario?
I hate this idea. I hate this idea because its simplicity is passingly attractive. But if you actually come and spend a day with an MP, you'll realise the role of an MP is a lot more than that. But also, it is about the vast majority of bills that go through Parliament. And also, we do a lot of voting and a lot of debating on non-bill issues. Some of it is very, very detailed. So the idea that somebody who is working a 10, 12, 14-hour day, and there are lots of people who are doing those sorts of hours, then has the time to spend looking at planning regulations, has the time to look at some of the crime and some of the really difficult community pieces of legislation that goes through. For example, I worked on a bill which was the Investigatory Powers Bill. It was 475 pages of legislation which is about the powers that go to our security services and our police and our law enforcement agencies to surveil and so forth. Now, if the public were invited to vote on that, you can bet your bottom dollar that campaigning organisations would reduce it to one sentence and one aspect of the bill, and people would be voting on something very, very limited that they've read in an email from a campaign group. They would not actually go away and read the 475 pages of the legislation, which I did, and come to a considered view about where to intervene, what needs to improve, and what we need to oppose in that bill, and whether overall to vote for it. So I think it would have the most terrible impact on the way legislation is scrutinised, and also the way that legislation does get through. I mean, we elect MPs to have judgment and to use their judgment and their opinions and their sort of research on behalf of a community. I think direct democracy works in some cases, but not in all. And I think the Brexit referendum told us that. I think if we had direct democracy on individual pieces of legislation, we would end up having Brexit 10 times a week.
Do you favour the carrot or the stick? Is it better to reward people for good behaviour or to punish them for bad behaviour, for example, in the use of plastic bags or the consumption of sugary drinks?
I'm sorry I can't just say one thing or the other, because there are times we need both, and there are times I can give examples of where we need to do a third thing, which is just get out the way and leave people to get on with it. So I think sometimes we need to live in a world where the state is far more active. There are some people who need more support to completely fulfill the potential they have as individuals and as communities and families. There are other times people do need the stick. They need to be sometimes, I'm trying to think of a lesser word than coerce, but they need active encouragement to take hold of the opportunities for support that exist. There are other times they need to be incentivised, but there are yet more times, and I think of things like Sure Start, where communities came together, set up a Sure Start. I think sometimes when they really succeed, and those Sure Starts have real ambition for their local community, but they're not being kept within the rules that government sort of set out for Sure Start, we need to just let go and let the community take over it and let that thing become what the community needs it to be. So I think it's a combination of all these things, that the state sometimes needs to be more active, and then sometimes it needs to be much more proactive in encouraging people to get the support that's out there. And I mean proactive, by that I mean we need to be knocking on more doors rather than waiting for people to come and seek the help, which is sometimes there and they don't have full access to.
We know the publicity surrounding the use of WhatsApp groups in Parliament. Do you think the use of WhatsApp groups by MPs is a good or bad thing for democracy, and why?
Well, any amounts of communication between MPs is a good thing, whether it is sitting around tables behind closed doors, whether it's in the chamber of the House of Commons and it's in public, whether it's in the media, or whether it is WhatsApp. Any communication is a good thing. There's nothing anti-democratic about MPs chatting privately. But also, don't forget that partly this is in response to the reforms of the House of Commons. Before I became an MP, which was 2.5 years ago, 5, 10, 15 years ago, the House sat late 2 or 3 times a week. Now the House sits late once a week. So once a week we will have a sitting on a Monday till at least 10 o'clock in the evening. Once a month or twice a month, sometimes 3, we'll go later than that, sometimes till 2 or 3 in the morning. When that happens, we're all locked into Parliament, the building itself. So you'll find that the places where we all eat together, whether it's the canteens or the tea room or whatever, or the places that you can socialise together, are jam-packed, and we're all sort of catching up. And that's great. It's really important that we as MPs do that. And when you're in a period where Parliament is less, like at the moment, this week that we're talking, we've had no votes this week. So you'll find there's not many MPs around, so we rely quite heavily on WhatsApp. One of the negative impacts of the reforms of the House of Commons, the good thing is it's made it much more family friendly. The bad thing is that we're so busy when we are here that we have very little time to actually communicate. So I share an office with Wes Streeting, the MP for Ilford North, but we probably only see each other once or twice a week because we're both so busy, we're not actually in the office very much. It's really hard for MPs to get together. Now the negative side is, these are my WhatsApp messages that have come in the last hour and a half. And these are the ones that I haven't muted. So you'll see that there are lots and lots and lots of messages. And I'm in WhatsApp groups for my intake of an MP, so all the 2015 intake for Labour MPs. I'm in a WhatsApp group about Europe because I take a very strident view on Brexit. I want this to be an issue which we really coordinate well on, so I'm in some WhatsApp groups for that. And I'm in some WhatsApp groups which are much more sort of general, just discussion groups. And they're really important. They're great ways of staying on top of things and having discussions and getting your voice heard. But sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming.
Finally, which MP from another party do you most admire and why?
Ken Clarke. Yeah, I think Ken Clarke is someone that I think is a really fascinating character. He's been in politics since 1970, the year I was born. He was elected to Parliament the year I was born. And he served in almost all of the great states of office. So he's been Chancellor of the Exchequer, he's been Justice Secretary, he's been Home Secretary in his time for different Prime Ministers. And he has a real frankness in the way he talks about politics. He's very open-hearted and very open-spirited. He seems as happy to answer questions I've got about politics and his own background and experience as he is from anybody of any other party. He takes the profession of being a parliamentarian very, very seriously, which makes him a really interesting person. I was fortunate enough to be invited to go on a delegation to China, and he was on the delegation and he led it with Peter Mandelson. And in the course of this delegation, we met the Vice President of China and a whole bunch of other very senior people. So to see how people of his caliber and experience represented our country at that level was a huge learning experience for me, because I take this job and the need to learn and grow in the job very, very seriously. And he's somebody, when you're in a chamber, that when he speaks, I stop and I listen very intently. And there are some times I sort of find myself stopping or switching off of being a politician and switching into being a student. It's like being in a seminar sometimes when he's giving speeches, because he speaks with a very frank wisdom, a sort of common sense approach to politics, combined with a real learned, hard work based on reading and experience and evidence. And he demonstrates the experience of somebody who's been doing this stuff for a very, very long time. So I find him a fascinating political character. I think there's a lot that people from all parties, including myself, can learn from on him. And also, in the few times I have spent time with him, he's huge fun. And you can't underestimate the pleasure of being people who are that talented, but also a huge fun to be with as well.